Good evening. Welcome, everyone. If the folks in the back could come forward. I think there still are a few seats, not too many, but we're delighted to welcome you all to this evening's 8th annual Victor Dzau Distinguished Lecture in Global Health. Actually, this evening's event is not going to be a lecture. So you see that we are in fact going to have more of a fireside chat, and I'll tell you all about that in a moment. But just to say that I'm Chris Byrer. I'm the director of the Duke Global Health Institute, now in my third year at this wonderful university, and we are so delighted to welcome you all here. This event, the Victor Dzau Lecture, began in 2018, and we've had a number of distinguished speakers, and this evening's, I'm sure, is going to be another wonderful evening. This was founded by Victor Dzau, who, of course, many of you will know as a former Duke Chancellor, now currently the President of the National Academy of Medicine, and Ruth Cooper Dzau, his wife, who is with us here this evening. Victor, unfortunately, is on international travel and couldn't be with us, but he has been very much in communication. So Victor also, of course, played a role in the launching of DGHI, now 19 years old, so next year will be our 20th anniversary as a Global Health Institute. And I think it's fair to say, for those of us in the field and people interested in global health, I don't have to tell this audience that we are in one of the toughest times in global health, really in the history of the field. And there are enormous challenges ahead. There, of course, have been significant program and budget disruptions. There has been a major change in policy and focus, including, of course, policies that have really impacted USAID, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief, the President's Malaria Initiative, a whole array of global health challenges. But, of course, we are a resilient community. Our partners are resilient institutions. And I think we have someone here with us this evening in Yong Kim who can really help us think about how to navigate this extraordinarily challenging period. So just before I introduce our speakers who are going to come to the stage, I want to say a few other words, first of all, about Victor and Ruth, and thanking the Dzaus for endowing this evening, this event, this lectureship. And please join me in thanking Ruth. I don't know where you're seated. Oh, there you are, my dear. Okay. So before I make those introductions, I also want to acknowledge and speak to one of the key members of the global health community, and somebody who played a very important role in the founding of the Duke Global Health Institute, and that is, of course, the late Paul Farmer. So Paul was one of the co-founders of Partners in Health, and Yong Kim was one of his co-founders as well. We also have Todd McCormick with us this evening. So we have 3 co-founders of Partners, and that's incredibly important because Partners in Health has really become, over the years, one of the central organizations in our field. Partly because it has always done high-quality care delivery for the poorest of the poor and in the most remote areas, but also because it has always had important academic connections, including with Harvard. And of course, the work that Paul's role really began here at Duke when he was an undergrad. Jim was talking about this today, and the experience that he had in a medical anthropology class that really began his thinking about this work. He eventually was a founding member of the Institute, and then was on our advisory board for a number of years. So Paul's legacy and his DNA is really woven throughout DGHI and Duke, and we are really honored this evening that Paul's widow, Didi Bertrand Farmer, is with us, and also his sister is with us. Absolutely. And we're working hard with partners and with UGHI to think about and develop the ways that we can honor Paul's legacy here at Duke. And this evening is very much a part of that effort. We have put together a video. The full video will be sent to everybody who's registered for this event. But I wanted to share with you just a kind of a short clip of the video that really, I think, gives you a sense of Paul's legacy here at Duke and what we're really hoping to build upon. So could we put that on?
When people have had the kind of acclaim that Paul earned and have had the kind of impact in the ways that he did, it's always interesting to watch how they navigate in their alma mater. And certainly Duke is absolutely thrilled about its connection to Paul. And Paul was thrilled about Duke. Paul was like a, dyed-in-the-wool Dookie. He loved this place.
He was a man whose work had huge impact. And that's also what we're trying to do. We're trying to have impacts in the real world.
I think the way that Dr. Farmer did global health is more relevant now than ever, and how he espoused it was such a tenacious way of doing global health, but also such a human way, doing it alongside instead of for.
That is Paul Farmer. That certainly was always at the core of who he was. And that began here at Duke.
Yeah. I have to say the full video is really beautiful and moving, and we're delighted to be able to share that with you. So now on to the main event. We're so fortunate to have with us really one of the pioneers in the field of global health, and a man who really has been shaping our field now for 4 decades. And like Paul Farmer, Jim Kim is both a physician and an anthropologist. They actually began their intellectual journey together thinking about anthropology and medicine. And he has really, in all the many leadership roles that he's had, kept that fundamental primary relationship with human-centered approaches and really keeping the people we all seek to serve at front and center and at the heart of what he's done. So I already mentioned to you that Jim Kim was a co-founder of Partners in Health. He also played a really important role in the early days when he was at the World Health Organization in the 3x5 program. That was a visionary idea of treating 3 million people with HIV/AIDS by the year 2005. And at the time, you have to remember, there were something closer to 30 million people living with HIV worldwide, and there was very little belief that treatment was either going to be accessible or effective or doable in much of the world. But both Paul Farmer and Jim Kim really shared the vision that everybody deserves treatment for these kind of life-threatening conditions, and they really helped make that happen. From 2003 to 2005, he was at WHO, and then in 2009, he became the president of Dartmouth College and led that extraordinary university and medical school. He was the first physician and the first Asian American to have that role. And then we were all in the global health field, I would say a little bit amazed, but also delighted when President Barack Obama appointed Jim to be the head of the World Bank Group and to be again the first physician ever to lead the World Bank. And under Jim's leadership from 2012 to 2019, the bank really made investments, unprecedented investments in development, and really taking on the problem of extreme poverty, which I think is what we would all hope that a World Bank would do, and Jim's leadership was really transformational there. He's been the recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. He's been named by Time Magazine one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He's now the vice chairman of Global Infrastructure Partners. And in 2022, which is so highly relevant for Partners in Health and for this evening, he stepped in the role that Paul had had before he passed and became the chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity in Butaro, Rwanda. And it's an extraordinary, visionary place, an amazingly hopeful place. I'm happy to say that the dean of the medical school now is a faculty member at Duke. Yay, Bebe Bekele, and I'm a faculty member at UGHI, which I'm really honored about and delighted about. So Jim is going to be in conversation this evening with another remarkable global health leader, and that is Professor Wendy O'Meara. Wendy is the Deputy Director of DGHI. She's a distinguished malaria researcher, spent many years, 15 years, living and working in Kenya on malaria, and continues to be really an active leader in this field. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jim Kim and Wendy O'Meara to come to the stage.
Okay, are we on now? Yeah. So, Jim, it's really my pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you, and we're so honored and delighted to have you here. I think Chris has already alluded to the fact that this is a very challenging moment in global health. And I want to take us out of that moment for a minute, and I want to take us back to the very beginning. The beginning of your journey in global health and health equity, and when you met Paul Farmer during your studies in medicine and anthropology. And can you just share with us how that very interdisciplinary program and your foundational undergraduate program shaped your career and the formation of Partners in Health?
Well, first of all, it's just so wonderful to be here at Duke. You know, I was always very envious of Paul for having come to Duke. I played basketball through high school. I mean, me being here with Adam Silver, the first time my kids thought I was cool was when I told them I was going to meet with Adam Silver, right? but Paul had a lot of pride in being at Duke. And when I said, okay, what do you know about basketball at Duke, Paul? He goes, well, there was Mike Jaminski and Gene Banks and Jimmy Spanarkel on the class of 1982 team, but that's all he knew, right? And we tried to get him more interested in sports so that he could be healthier. And one year, this was after he met Adam, he went to the All-Star weekend with Wes Edens, one of the contributor to Partners in Health and a really good guy. And so Paul he was watching one of the events, and he said to Wes, he said, you know, this is much more fun. I've never been to a basketball game like this. I think I could really be interested in this. And Wes looked at him and said, Paul, this is the slam dunk contest. The game's tomorrow. So Paul came by it honestly. But for example, so many of the roots of what we ended up building as Partners in Health came from here, right? So, Paul was just an extraordinary writer. I mean, he actually wrote one novel that Ophelia didn't like very much, and so he didn't publish it, but he was such a wonderful writer. And that started when he was the theater critic for the Duke Chronicle, right? But the first play he ever saw was the one that he had to write a review for, and he did, right? But then he kept writing. Weston LeBar was one of his professors, one of the great anthropologists, and Weston LeBar was a psychoanalytic anthropologist, right? And put Paul through 8 months of psychoanalysis just because he wanted Paul to have that experience. Woody Gaines was another great professor here who really developed Paul into what everyone on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School said, that Paul was the most fully formed anthropologist they'd ever met. So his way of thinking about the world and coming to conclusions was through many different channels. I mean, we, as graduate students, of course, we read everything. We read philosophy, we read sociology, we read anthropology. We read so broadly in history. And so the conversation we started, it was really in 1987, 1988. We had been friends since 1982 when we both graduated. We met through the the program at Harvard. But in 1987, 88, he'd already made a major commitment to Haiti. And I had just returned from my own PhD fieldwork experience. And we started asking some really fundamental questions. I had actually thought that I was going to go back to Korea do my PhD studies and then go back and then sort of help them develop their healthcare system. But the healthcare system was so well developed, they were saying, we don't need you. We're actually getting ready for the Olympics, right? So Korea had already gone past so many stages. And then when I came back, he asked me to go to Haiti. And I went to Haiti for the first time, but in the 6 months leading up to it, we, with our backgrounds in both medicine and anthropology, we really began asking the question, well, what is to be done? So what should you do? And he was very patient with me because he'd already decided, right? And his approach to this was, what would it mean to commit yourself fully to providing absolutely the best possible quality of care to the poorest people in the Western Hemisphere, right? And he suffered for it. I mean, he was insomniac for most of his life, and mostly because in Haiti he was usually the only physician. He wasn't even a fully certified physician at the time, but he was usually the one who stayed up late at night to make sure that people with cerebral malaria or people with very advanced cases of tuberculosis would survive the night, right? So he already knew that what had been acceptable as, at that time we called it international health and not global health, what was acceptable in international health circles was not going to be acceptable to him. And we came up with this idea about making a preferential option for the poor. Mm-hmm. And that came after reading all the great theorists, after Marx, Weber, Durkheim, everybody, after reading all the great theorists, he had come upon the work of a group of Latin American priests. And they said it very simply. They said, and there was an inherent critique of Catholicism. And the way they wrote about it was to say, if the Jesus that we knew were living here today, where would he be? Would he be with the generals and the politicians and the rich people, which frankly most of the bishops and cardinals were, or would he be living and working among the very poorest? And the answer to that is really pretty straightforward, right? And so the liberation theologians talked about a preferential option for poor like this. They said, well, we love everybody because that's what their God, that's what their Savior Jesus said to them. But we have a preference for the poor. In a situation, if we have to choose, our preference is for the poor. And so Paul, Paul himself was religious and Catholic. I was not religious. So many other people in Partners in Health came from many different faith backgrounds. But it seemed like a pretty simple question. What would it mean to live out in your own life in the way that you did development work, in the way that you did healthcare? The tenets of the great traditions, right? The Buddhists have their ideas about compassion. In Judaism, there's this notion of tikkun olam, healing the world. And so we thought that no matter what tradition you looked at, there was this fundamental challenge to all of us that, will you stand up and do the right thing, do everything you possibly can for the most marginalized, the poorest, the forgotten ones. And so we said, okay, that's what we're going to do. And we also said at the time, because this was in 1987, 88, there was no Gates Foundation, there was no PEPFAR, there was no, the money in international health at that time was almost non-existent. So we said, okay, we're never going to be on the winning side. We will always have to stand with the losers. We're never going to be very large because we're going to be trying to do things that most people think are impossible or shouldn't be done, right? And so the epistemology of Partners in Health, just sort of how we decided what was fact and what was fiction and what was the nature of our moral responsibility, our intellectual responsibility, and what history taught us, came from his work here at Duke. So every time I come here, I feel like, wow, this is where it happened. And it has transformed Paul's vision, Paul's experience, Paul's personality, his life really started here. Because when he came here on his first day, he was a Republican who was against socialized medicine, and he wanted to be a rich medical doctor. And Duke did this to him and for him in a way that is just historical. I mean, he completely changed the direction of my life, and I'm very proud of myself right now because it's at 3 years and I'm finally able to talk about him without breaking down. But he was that kind of guy.
I hadn't appreciated how profound Duke's impact was on Paul to change from, being a Republican to. But
he was in a fraternity, by the way. And Todd doesn't even know which one it was. Do you know which one it was now?
But going back to those the first commitments and the first programs that Partners in Health put forward, like you said, this was before USAID, before big investments from Gates, even before the Global Fund. And you shared with me that a lot of people really didn't think it was possible to provide high quality care in these resource constrained environments. And you faced a lot of opposition and a lot of naysayers and a lot of friction. So what made you confident that you could do it?
Yeah. So let me just tell you the story about drug-resistant tuberculosis. So we were literally living on fumes, and Ophelia would say to us on a regular basis, "Boys, with what dosh are we going to do that?" Right? She was the practical one. She was the one who was maintaining our budget. But I started this project in the slums of Lima, Peru, in a place called Caraballo, and completely by accident. We thought we were going to do just very basic public health stuff in this community, but we came upon these cases of people who were in a really good tuberculosis control program, but kept failing. Right? And we really didn't know exactly what the World Health Organizations and others were doing, but their official position on people with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, that's a form of tuberculosis resistant to the two most important drugs, their official position was don't treat them, right? And in fact, it was even worse than that because the official recommendation was add a single drug to a failing regimen, right? So it's the one sort of rule of thumb that every medical student learns from the beginning. Tuberculosis was mostly a 4-drug treatment, and the one thing you never do is add a single drug to a failing regimen because they'll just develop resistance to that drug, right? That was the official recommendation for developing countries. And so we looked at these cases, and the cost of the medicines alone was about $25,000, right? And the treatment took 18 to 24 months. So it was one of the most difficult things to treat of all medicine. Of course, you know that one. When we started, the only way we could treat them was one of our co-founders, Thomas J. White, who had made his fortune in the construction industry, shared our commitment to making a preferential option for the poor. He was a very devout Catholic. We would go to him and say, "Tom, we've got to do this because it's not just for the people in Peru. If we can show that we can get this done, we may be able to change policy for the entire world." And I don't think there's a single other human being on earth at that time who would have given us the money to do that. Right? And he kept saying to us, though, he said, "But Jim, $25,000 just for the drugs. Do you know what we could do in Haiti if we use that money in Haiti?" And he was right. Mm. We could have fed so many people. But then Paul did something really amazing. Just thinking back on it still, it gives me chills. He went and started talking to our leaders from the village. These were village women. This was Didi. This was Madame Mac, right? Madame Mac was one of the sort of pillars of that world. And Paul told her, you know, Madam Mac, we have these people that we found who are suffering from drug-resistant tuberculosis. And he explained the whole situation to her. Yeah, and he said, but I feel conflicted because with that money, we could do so much more in Haiti. And she said, Paul, don't you think about that. Those poor people who have tuberculosis, you're the only ones who care about them. You must treat them, right? And so for Paul, it was a lesson for all of us. He said, you know, it's only, and he would call them folder heads. He said, only the folder heads in the international health world would tell you that human life is not cost effective, right? So we started treating them. And it was an outbreak. You know, in a town of 100,000 people, 50 cases we found of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And so we started treating them. But when we started, we thought they would say, thank you. You know, we've been wondering how we're going to treat these people. Thank you for doing it. That's not what they said. They said, the director of the national program said, if you treat a single patient, we will kick you out of the country. Right?
Wow.
So, and then we learned, because we went to the Pan American Health Organization, and they say, we support, Pedro Suarez was his name, we support Pedro completely. And then we went to WHO in Geneva, and they said, we support him completely. Do not treat a single patient. And you know what? They probably don't have MDR-TB, right? So we started bringing their sputum samples, right, back to the Massachusetts State Lab, because I was the sputum runner for many of the instances. And there were these signs up in the Miami airport saying, don't bring meat, don't bring fruits and vegetables, nothing that said don't bring sputum, right? So we would bring the sputum samples up, and we would take them, and the first day we did it, we drove to the Mass State Lab, and we left it there, and we put Paul Farmer, Brigham and Women's Hospital, right? And we were still trainees at the time, right? So then the Department of Medicine got a call saying, who the hell is this Paul Farmer? He's got 5 drug-resistant TB, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing was they probably don't have MDR-TB, so we proved that they do have MDR-TB. The second thing, they said, well, but it's too expensive. The drugs are just too expensive. And then I asked a very simple question. Of the people at the World Health Organization who said it's too expensive, I said, do you know if the drugs are off patent or on patent? And they didn't know. You know, if they would have said anything else, I would have felt so differently, but they didn't know, right? And Paul would call it the fecklessness of the elite in the face of the suffering of the poor, right? My jaw dropped. I said, you mean you've declared a death sentence on everyone in the poor world living with MDR-TB, and you don't even know if the drugs are generic or not, right? And it turned out everyone was generic except the fluoroquinolones. And we were able, in about 3 months, to drop the price by 90% on average, just by having generic manufacturers in China and elsewhere do it. And so eventually, we won that fight, right? And they changed policy. And then right after that, we started hearing the same arguments against treating HIV, right? And this time, it was literally everyone. I mean, John O'Quick is here, and John was at the WHO when we were going through this. And John, by the way, if you don't know, he's a faculty here, family medicine, but he was head of the Rational Drug Use Program, and he always supported us, right? But the rational drugs people were thought of as the Marxists of WHO, right? but Jono supported us trying to get MDR-TB drugs. He supported us before the TB teams supported us, and then also for HIV. And so, we were sitting there and we were saying something pretty simple, right? 25 million people in the world living with HIV, the vast, vast majority living in poor countries. And after 1996, of course, we had highly active antiretroviral therapy. And we were saying, are you really telling all the people in developing countries that they're dead? That this is it? That, too bad. I'm sorry. You're living in a poor country. You will have to die, right? And that's exactly what they were saying. We had a couple of really great advocates, though. Tony Fauci was one of them, right? And Tony said, look, I don't know how to treat HIV in Haiti or in Africa. But if you guys tell me it can be done, I work my butt off to get these drugs to market. And if you can make it work, let's do it. From our perspective, it was so much easier than MDR-TB treatment, right? MDR-TB treatment has these toxic, terrible drugs, 5 or 6 of them with an injectable. So, these people were getting intramuscular injections 6 days a week for 12 months, right? It's so hard. By that time, by 2000, there were fixed dose combinations with, 3 pills in 1 pill, 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening. It was so much easier. And we just were shocked that once again, people were saying it's impossible, you can't do it, you can't do it. Now that many years later, 25 years later, everyone has converted themselves to a treatment advocate, but I can tell you, there was almost nobody, right, John? I mean, it was literally nobody who was in favor of it. So I went to WHO. Paul and I ran the campaign of J.W. Lee, because he was like one of the only other Korean guys, in global health, and he was a lowly, director of the TB department. But Paul and I'll tell you some other day all the little things that we did to help get him elected. But on the morning of January 28th, 2003, he was elected. 4:00 in the morning. That's when he called me to say he got elected. That evening, after Paul visited the White House with Tony Fauci and showed him our before and after pictures of treating HIV in Haiti, right, President Bush announced the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Right? Yeah. So, I tell the story as if it just, like a just so story, but I'm telling you it was not a just so story. We almost ran out of money so many times in treating MDR-TB. The HIV treatment scale-up was so incredibly difficult. Everybody was against it. Everybody was against it. And I would go around saying things to people like, okay, 25 million people in Africa living with HIV. The only industry that's growing right now is the coffin-making industry in most of sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, I'm sure you were there. And if we turn our backs and say to these people, sorry, you're in a poor country and you're going to have to make do with prevention, we will forever be remembered, just like the Germans from the 1940s, as the generation that turned its back and allowed a genocide to rage forward. We will be remembered as that generation, right? And so we tried everything. We tried everything to make these arguments, and once we finally got the drugs out there, right? It was an amazing phenomenon because, with HIV treatment, it's literally the Lazarus effect. You look like you're a skeleton and you're going to die. You take these medicines, you get better, right? And so now I think 28 million people in Africa are on treatment for HIV. And, I'd say that Paul was the most important person in making that transition happen. I later was able to talk to George W. Bush. And, but more importantly, in 2011, I gave George H.W. Bush an honorary degree. And he was, he was very old back then, but the first time I met him, I said, President Bush, I just want to tell you that your son is still a hero all throughout Africa. And what he did changed the fate of a continent. And he began weeping, George H.W. Bush. He said, he really believed in that. And it was so hard because everyone told him not to do it. Yeah. Right? So, I mean, Duke, through Paul Farmer, has, really helped to avert a disaster of just, absolutely historic proportions. See, it all comes back to Duke, right?
Just going back to one of the things you said about the motivations for your work that you just shared, and I've heard you say this before, what will my children think of my generation if we let this problem go unchecked? And I think it's easy for us now to look back at those moments in TB and HIV and see the moral imperative, right? But what are the challenges that we're facing today that our children are going to hold us accountable for if we don't confront them head on?
So when I tell this story, to a new group of undergraduates, you see them shaking their heads. Oh my God, that's just, how could they possibly have been against, treating everybody living with HIV in Africa? I mean, that's just terrible. And then I always stop them. I said, the point in me telling you this story is not to look with disdain at your predecessors. The point is to ask yourself, what is that going to be? And I actually, I'm working a lot on mental health right now because, boy, that is, I can't tell you how many people I meet who have great health insurance, are some people very wealthy, who, when their child has a problem with mental illness, can't find the right care. So it's here. But if it's that way here, can you imagine what it's like in developing countries? So I think, mental health is one of the issues where we'll say, how could we have allowed the stigma to survive for so long? How could we have shunned, people living with mental illness for so long? How could we have stood by as suicides happened? Right? There's so many wonderful tools now. Psychological first aid, mental health first aid, to help people look around at others to ask the question: is this person doing okay? Mm-hmm. So we're trying to find a way of getting things like psychological first aid into the schools. In my 3 years at Dartmouth, there were no suicides, and none in the 10 years before that. Right? 2 years ago, there were 8. Right? Because suicide is almost like an infectious disease. Right? The thinking goes that what I understand is that in many cases, the young people are thinking, all right, I don't want to die, but I can't take the pain anymore, right? And they hear about another suicide and they think, oh, I see. So the path out of this pain is just to have the courage to do what that person did, right? And I'm working on this in Korea of all places because it has the highest suicide rate by far of any developed country, and the mental health issues have concentrated down in Korea into the lowest birth rate ever recorded in human history, right, for a nation state. So I think that's one of the issues that they'll look back on. So I think of course climate change is going to be a huge one, right? My 16-year-old son says to me all the time, "Dad, you didn't do enough at the World Bank on climate change," right?
He's already holding you accountable.
I'm trying to just, but Nico, we went from giving 0 for climate change to being the largest funders of climate change, and now they're at 30 billion. He said, no, but you still didn't do enough, right? So I think it's a good thing to ask yourself, and are you working on those things that, in 15 years, in 20 years, people are going to say, God, can you imagine that they allowed that situation to happen? I'm trying to still do that. I'm trying to still work on those sort of seemingly intractable problems that require our attention.
And so what are the lessons from those early days in Partners that you would encourage us to apply to those challenges looking forward?
So, if I look back and say, so how is it that we were in such conflict with otherwise, these were good people. These are people who dedicated their lives to international health at the time. Why were we so at odds with these folks? And I think it's because we started with the more fundamental questions, right? The question that Paul asked me all the time was, and he called me Jimbo. He said, Jimbo, with our ridiculously elaborate educations, what's the nature of our moral responsibility to the rest of the world, right? And I think starting with these much more fundamental questions about, what is meaningful in your life and what do you commit to in your life, starting there put us on a different footing, right? I think the others started off with great technical expertise. They were great researchers. They were great physicians. But it didn't take much to convince them that it was impossible to do something for poor people, right? The cost effectiveness people I mean, look, the greatest cost-effectiveness scholar in the history of global health is Chris Murray. He's my good friend. We were in internship and residency under Victor Dzau together at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And he always thought of it as just a mathematical tool, right? But they became so powerful that everyone thought that it was a moral imperative, right? You should only do things that are quote-unquote cost-effective. But what we screamed to the rooftops was, yeah, but that depends on what the numerator is, right? We know how many people you're dividing by, but why are you assuming that the numerator now will always be the numerator, right? Mm-hmm. And so even though there wasn't money in the world for HIV treatment, we just felt like, I mean, we had this experience with drug-resistant TB. We felt like it was absolutely our moral imperative to keep pushing on this issue. Mm-hmm. But I mean, there was a mathematical modeler at WHO, Jana knows who he is, who once said to me, right, it's unethical to treat MDR-TB in resource-poor countries, in poor countries. And if I have to walk over dead bodies to convince you of that, I will, wow. Right? So we didn't get the anger at us, right? Yeah. And so it got to the point where we would go to these TB meetings. And Paul and I usually were traveling all over the world, and we hadn't seen each other. And we loved sitting next to each other, enjoying a meal, talking about things. But we had to put ourselves at different ends of the table because we knew that if we didn't do that and we sat together, that end of the table would start working up a lather about how crazy we were, right? That's how hard we had to work at it. And so, I think if you're going to go into a business like this, there's just so many, moral conundrums that you face that you really got to know, what you stand for.
Yeah, yeah. So the name of this event refers to an unfinished agenda for global health equity. And I think our experience over the last few months makes us even feel even more uncertain about ever finishing that agenda. So in this moment, what gives you hope that we can still make progress towards that agenda?
Well, I've just met today Matt Cohn, and he's a high school teacher, and he has been getting these high school students really interested in Partners in Health from a very young age. There are groups at so many universities. I think at Duke there is one too, right? The groups of young, what's it called again? PIH Engage, right? And they're so enthusiastic, right? So they always give me encouragement. But I tell you, look, from having gone through these periods where we had no money, that there was just the Gateses hadn't come on board yet. We had no money. There's still this is a world pregnant with possibility because there are so many more people who are interested in global health. I mean, in my medical school class, there were exactly 2 of us out of 160 who had any interest in international health. Paul, exactly the same, 2 people, right? Mm-hmm. Now it's easily half of the class, right? So something has changed fundamentally. And so when people ask me this, I say, look, just remember what Wayne Gretzky used to say, right? Good players skate to where the puck is, and great players skate to where the puck is going to be. We have to prepare for the day that this will be over. Right, I firmly believe that. There's just, everyone's scared now, right? Everyone is sort of retreating into fear, but I think that the changes that have been wrought. So many people have read Mountains Beyond Mountains. So many people know about Paul's life. I mean, I don't think I'll ever meet again a human being who's as capable of selflessness as Paul, right? Mm. And now that because his life has been so well documented, I think people will come back to it, right? Come back to it. And and I also think in all the great religious traditions, there are these fundamental ideas about the nature of our commitment to others, right? That won't go away, right? Right now, it's all about personal vendetta and, a mean-spiritedness that I've never seen before. But I don't think that's the fundamental human condition. At least that's what I've experienced over and over and over again. People who may have been dismissive and hard-hearted at one point, who are moved and changed because of the great acts of decency of people like Paul and so many now people working in this field.
Yeah. So I'm going to go out of order a little bit here and take a question from the audience that we received, the questions that we solicited from the individual you mentioned, Matt Cohn. We adapted his question. And essentially what he asked was, as our world becomes more divided and partisan, how do we keep ourselves open to collaborating with people with whom we don't agree? And where do we draw the line between sort of seeking compromise and standing against actions that we find to be immoral?
Yeah, it's a.
You get one question you can pass on.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. But let me just give you an example from Paul Farmer's life, right? So Paul always said to us, the one, and this was a time when the sort of villain for Paul was one of your former senators, Jesse Helms, right? And he used to say, God, I just pray that I don't ever sit in an airplane seat next to Jesse Helms because I'm afraid I'll like him, right? Paul, we used to meet people who were, various grades of objectionable, and he would always say, "But I liked him," right? He literally avoided people who he just vehemently disagreed with politically because he was afraid that he would like them on a personal level, right? And so I remind myself of that, right? This fundamental ability to see the humanity in just about anyone, right? And the other thing is, he would always say, the one thing in people who I just object to, on any other level, the worst thing that can happen to me is if they become my patient, right? Because then sort of, all bets are off. So I've never reached that level myself, but just having that as a model is encouraging to me. I think Paul would, he'd be distraught like the rest of us, but I think he'd be planning for, where the puck's going to be.
Yeah. That's really powerful to think about, remaining open to the humanity of the opposition, right? Just feeling like we spend a lot of time creating tribes and othering, people that we disagree with. And so I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this sort of comes back to another quote that you have repeated often from a man named John Stuart Dickey, who is Dartmouth's president.
Dickey, yeah.
In the years after World War II. And he said, "The world's troubles are your troubles, and there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix."
So,
do you believe that?
Yeah, I do, and that's how I got my job at Dartmouth, right? So I interviewed for the Dartmouth, and I wasn't like the ideal candidate to become a university president like your president, Vince Price, right? This is a man who was built for the job. I was not built for the job. But the headhunter came to see me because somebody on the search committee asked them to come interview me. And so they interviewed me, John Isaacson, who's the dean of search company representatives. And he interviewed me for 3 hours, had read everything I wrote, everything I said. And after 3 hours, he said, "Jim, I just want to tell you, there's no way you're going to get this job." He said, "I think you're a really interesting guy, but there's no way you're going to get this job. And if you want a job like this, you have to go be a dean or a provost somewhere, right?" So I thought, wow, I like the guy. John, right? I like the guy, and it was a good experience. I mean, it was like going through psychotherapy for 3 hours, so it was a good experience. And but then he called me, a few days later. He said, "Jim, I have no idea why, but the search committee wants to meet you." Right? And so I mean, this is like for the young people, a lesson in how you prepare for a job, right? So I read everything about Dartmouth. I'd never set foot on the campus before because the Dartmouth was the home of the Dartmouth Review, whose editor-in-chief at one point was Laura Ingraham, right? So I in my own mind, those of you who were around in 1982 Dartmouth put out something called their Ebonics issue, which was horrendous. It was just disgustingly racist. So I'd never visited there, but then I started reading everything I could find. And so after William Buckley's National Review, they had started something called the Dartmouth Review, and I read every issue of the Dartmouth Review. And this quote came out of there. And I heard that quote, and I thought, oh my God, there's nothing wrong with the world that better human beings cannot fix. So after reading everything I could about Dartmouth, they came and they interviewed me. And the last question was, so why do you want this job? And I said, well, I've never been interested in a job like this. But you guys remember John Sloan Dickey, right? And they said, of course. I said, well, he said this, and I'd memorized it. And I said, the world's troubles are your troubles. And he was the very first head of communications at the State Department. The State Department never had a head of communications before, and it was in FDR's government, right? So he knew what he was talking about when he said the world's troubles are your troubles. And so I said, if what you want me to do is to nurture the better human beings that can tackle the world's troubles, I think I can do that. And a couple of the old-timer alums had tears in their eyes. And then when I went to meet with the entire search committee, I had another quote from Ernest Martin Hopkins about the sweetness that is the core of Dartmouth, right? So those two together, they really were, all of them were crying, right? And John Isaacson was probably right that I wasn't the right person for that job. But then, 3 years in, I got a call from Tim Geithner, who was Secretary of the Treasury, Dartmouth class of '83. And the only reason Tim ever called me was that he had a friend who had a kid who wanted to go to Dartmouth. So I literally had a pad of paper ready to write down the name. And he said, how'd you like to be president of the World Bank? And I said to him, I was the chief editor of a book calling for the closing of the World Bank on its 50th anniversary. And he said, we know. We've read it. We've read the whole thing. We know. I said, that doesn't disqualify me. No, that doesn't disqualify you. Can you come see President Obama? I said, when? He said, how about tomorrow? So what that meant was they had gone down a long list of possible candidates, and they got to me, and they had a deadline, right? So I went down 2 days later, and I had been so enamored of Barack Obama that I read everything about him, and it turned out that his mother was a PhD anthropologist. She'd done a PhD anthropology at the University of Hawaii. And I couldn't find it anywhere, and so I had to order it from the University of Michigan Archives, right? And so I got it and read the whole thing. And so 2 days later, I was down meeting with President Obama, and he's got this incredible presence, He said, so Jim, he went right to the point. He said, so Jim, why on earth should I nominate you, a physician and an anthropologist, and not, say, a macroeconomist, right? So I said, well, President Obama, have you read your mother's PhD dissertation? And he looked at me and he said, well, yes, I have, right? And on the one hand, he's the only president, I think, who would ever read a PhD dissertation, right? But I'm still not sure that he read it or not, right? But so being as generous as I could, I said, well, then you'll remember that your mother studied metal sculptors in Indonesia. And she worked with artisans, and she first wrote about the macroeconomists who were saying that globalization would destroy the artisanal industry in Indonesia. And in her dissertation, which was 1,000 pages with all these photographs, in her dissertation she showed that in fact metal sculptors flourished under globalization, and they started selling their artwork all over the world. So I said, I'm not going to be able to tell you what the world looks like from 30,000 feet like a macroeconomist, but I've been on the ground doing development work my whole life. I'll be able to tell you if these things work on the ground. He looked at me and he said, I get that, right? And Tim Geithner called me that evening and said, okay, you're the guy, right? And so I had to then, the minute I got the call, I told the head of my board at Dartmouth, and it was bad for Dartmouth that I had to leave. But this was probably the job that I've been training my whole life for. And later, he invited my wife and I to have dinner in the residence. And somebody was asking, so how did you get your job? And I told the story. And President Obama was smiling. He said, yeah, that was the best ploy to get a job I've seen yet. You know? So anyway, that long version of that story. But, you know, having had all these experiences now, right, experiences I never expected to have, I feel an even greater sense of responsibility to take things on. And, you know, we had a great series of meetings with the Global Health Group here, and, you know, Phil Cotton, our Vice Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity. I really think we can do some amazing things together in fields that have been ignored, right? I mean, I've come away from the experience today just extremely optimistic about, you know, the problems we can take on together.
Yeah, I agree. We have great human capital to apply to this problem for sure.
Absolutely.
And I think what our students can take away from this conversation is that preparing for an interview is extremely important. If at all possible, quote other people who have held that job.
And read everything, even in publications that you completely disagree with. I mean, you really got to do your homework. You know, a mentor of mine who was very close to Victor, a guy named Howard Hyatt. Howard told me that anytime, in a university anyway, he said, anytime anyone asks you to be a candidate for an important job, it's your responsibility to academia to take that offer very seriously and give them your view. He said, you might decide you don't want the job. They may decide they don't want you, but you will help shape their idea of what they want, right? So I always took that seriously. And then when I told Howard that I was now a candidate for being president of Dartmouth, he said, oh, Jim, don't do that. He said, you spend so much time fundraising and all these politics, you don't want to do that. And he was a dean of the School of Public Health at Harvard. And he didn't want me to leave. Yeah, I was working directly with him. He didn't want me to leave. But I think it's great advice. I think you take it seriously. And as you look into these different opportunities, it changes the way you think about things. Mm-hmm. And so if I would give other advice, I mean, we just had a great meeting with the students today. And they asked me this question, what would you do now? Well, you know, we're going to have to wait a bit to see where the puck is going to be, right? But in preparing yourself, I think, you know, I tell a story that I've told many times before, but my father was a very practical Korean dentist, right? And I was a transfer student to Brown, and I went from the University of Iowa to Brown University, and I was just so, you know, on fire from the experience of being in this amazing intellectual community at Brown. I came home from my first semester at Brown, and he picked me up and he said, so, Jim, what do you think you're going to study? I said, well, I had gotten into the Asian American movement, right? And I said, Dad, I think I'm going to study philosophy and political science and become part of a movement for Asian Americans. And he pulled the car over to the side of the road, right? And this is a guy who escaped from North Korea at the age of 19, right? And was on his own since that time. He turned around and he said, okay, Jim, look, once you finish your residency, you can study anything you want, right? Now, see, you guys laugh, but I've told this story to an audience of Korean Americans. Yeah. They don't laugh. They say, yeah, of course, right? And so he ended up being right, right? And so what I would say is in the time, I mean, there are not a lot of global health jobs out there right now. In the time between now and where the puck is going to be, get some skills, right? So it's you know, there's so many masters in global health these days, and those are great programs. But, you know, become a lawyer, become a doctor, you know, do an MBA, you become a statistician. You know, it's always, or become a great writer, because we always need better writers in global health. Prepare yourself for what's to come. And you know, bringing a skill to the table, as my father insisted that I do, has always been really, really helpful. Now, when you get to be my age, though, as I tell people all the time, I used to have skills, but now my only skills are scheming and plotting. But it turns out those are pretty important skills. Yeah.
We don't have a class on scheming and plotting, but interestingly, our undergraduate degree is a joint degree, and so all of our undergraduate global health majors also have that skill that they marry their global health interests with, which I think is really powerful.
It's a great time to do that. Great time to get a new skill.
So I'm going to shift a little bit to share with you some questions from the audience that were submitted prior to this event. One came from one of our master's students asking, if you were going to restart your career in global health today, knowing everything that you know now, where would you start? What would your trajectory look like?
I mean, if I could start it now and we go back to 1982 or something like that, right? First thing I'd do is go find Paul Farmer. Yeah, I mean, for those of us who really, and Dee Dee is here. For those of us who experienced it directly, right? The magic of being around Paul, I would absolutely. That would be the first thing that I would do. Mm-hmm. And I'd probably also do an anthropology degree. Anthropology is so much fun in so many ways. I mean, anthropologists are known as the greatest gossip mongers, right? That we getting the really good gossip from a particular group of people is how you put together great stories about what they're like. And so the great thing about being a doctor and an anthropologist is people want to tell doctors everything, right? Well, it's my daughter-in-law, and and doctors don't want to hear it, right? And people don't want to tell anthropologists anything because they know they'll just write about it, right? So that combination has worked really well. Right? I probably would do that again, but the first thing I'd do is I'd go find Paul.
Yeah, seeking out those visionaries.
Absolutely,
and,
the people who really just being around them change your life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was nobody like him.
Mm-hmm. There's another question here from another trainee at Duke, and this person is a resident. From what I've read about yours and Dr. Farmer's work, some of your public health successes were achieved through creativity and by working outside the typical channels or funding sources and institutions. So how would you advise those of us in our early careers to think outside the box to do our work effectively?
Yeah.
How do you learn that skill of thinking outside the box? And
I think it's part. You have to sort of have an internal Socratic method, right? And it's something that's just so much on the wane today, right? If you're only getting your news from one source, if you're only and this is a problem with the AI bots, right? That once you make some choices, they so skew the information you get into a particular direction that you're really not able to ask, very fundamental questions, right? And because we always started with epistemology, what can we really know, right? Evidence-based medicine is one of the greatest things that ever happened to the medical profession. But it only started like in the 80s, right, Chris? I mean, it hasn't been around that long, right? And, the great joke when I started my internship and residency in the late 80s, early 90s, was that you'd ask these great experts, right? We'd say, well, why, people with strokes sometimes have T-wave changes on their EKG. We'd say, well, why is that? And they'd say things to us like, well, we see this, right? Mm-hmm. You know what I'm talking about. There were so many things, in treating DVTs, deep vein thrombosis. For a long time, there wasn't good evidence, and you'd call these people, and they would tell you different dosage. There were always things like that. And then we had evidence-based medicine, right? And so now we have to have sort of evidence-based living, right? What are the things that are real, and what are the things that are not real? And it's just so difficult these days to find that. And so I think you start from epistemology, really be clear on what the facts are, and then from there, that's where creativity springs. If you're dealing with bad information, it's just creativity is more like delusion. Right?
Yeah. So I think there's one more question here. Then maybe I'll put this forward, and then we'll try to wrap up on sort of a more positive note. But We have a colleague who's asking us, or asking you, as we watch our colleagues at countless UN and non-UN organizations confront the changing fiscal environment with dramatic field activity and staff scale back, the near term seems bleak. What do you see as the lessons learned with regards to sustainable financing for global health? Do you see opportunities for the global health community can act on to avoid collapse with respect to the fragile gains of the past 25 to 30 years?
So, USAID was, an idea that was started with President Kennedy and that has been perpetuated and has done tremendous amount of good, right? But, John is here in the audience and knows USAID very well. I don't think we ever convinced the American people that providing aid at the level that we're providing is a good thing. And the strategy for continuing the aid flow was to always make sure that critical members of Congress and senators were getting plenty of USAID money into their constituents, right? So, how did we keep the Midwestern senators on board? Grain purchases, right? And this was at a time when grain purchases, and when you buy a whole bunch of grain and send it to an African country, that would often destroy the local grain markets, right? But it was thought to be so critical to keep Midwestern members of Congress and senators on board that we did that, right? So it was kind of, I completely believe in the USAID mission and what they've been doing in the world, but we didn't win the argument with the American people, right? Jim Mattis, can imagine having a guy like Jim Mattis as the defense secretary today. And Jim Mattis used to say all the time, I totally believe in USAID because the more money we have in USAID, the fewer bullets I have to buy, right? And I think most of the enlightened military leaders would say that to you, that everywhere I go, the fact that we are so generous makes a huge difference, right? Yeah. So I think we have to remake the argument. I think we have to, now remake the argument from the ground up. And that's going to be a great challenge, but, that is the challenge of the next few years.
Yeah. I think, in this challenging moment, I think that going forward 5 years, we're going to look back on this and recognize it as growing pains and not death throes. And so I think we just need to really reflect on the human capital we have to support each other as a community and to stay true to our core values. What would you add to that?
Again, it goes back to Paul, right? People who were otherwise extremely conservative about everything in their lives, would respond to Paul in a way that was very unexpected, right? And Paul, always believed that that people had good in them, and that he could sort of tease it out, right? And so, as much as I am offended by some of the things that now are happening, it's like we used to always say, right? And this is something that Paul and I said to each other, that when you're faced with the conditions in Haiti today, when you're faced with poverty and disease, so many of these problems, and you are a person who goes to Duke or who is a professor at Duke, optimism is not the result of didactic analysis. Optimism is a moral choice, right? Because if you are a person with a lot of resources, just like the cost-effectiveness people for TV, if you are a person with resources coming from powerful institutions, you go into a poor neighborhood or area and say, there's nothing, we can't, it's impossible, right? Then your pessimism dictates the outcome, right? And so the only chance we have is to choose to be optimistic, right? And as bad as it gets sometimes, I always remember that, right? That in situations of great poverty, you've got to choose to be optimistic, because otherwise you can't look for solutions that might be there, looking at you.
Thanks for that reminder that optimism is a choice.
And I would just say, you guys are so lucky to be at Duke, right? This is a wonderful place, and I look forward to lots of great joint work together with the University of Global Health Equity. You know, when I was first going to college, my mother, who had done her divinity degree at the Union Theological Seminary, right, said, "Well, why don't you guys look at, you know, for some Ivy League schools?" And both my brother and I said, "Oh, their sports teams are so terrible. We'd never want to go there." so I went to the University of Iowa, right? Didn't find it to be the roiling academic environment that I thought, so I applied for transfer, went to Brown, right? And I didn't even know about Duke, right? Because here's a school that's fantastic and also has a great basketball team, right? that would have been my dream school. So anyway, I'm so grateful that it nurtured Paul in the way that it did. The entire world owes Duke a debt of gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.